Welcome to Sparking Genius, hosted by the Dwight Global Network of Schools, a podcast series exploring what the future of education holds.
Welcome to Sparking Genius, the podcast where we dive deep into the dynamic and ever-evolving world of global education. I'm your host, Dianne Drew, Head of School at Dwight School, New York, and Global Education Director for the Dwight Network of Schools. In each episode, we explore how innovative ideas, technologies, and thought leaders are shaping the future of education worldwide. Today's episode takes us into the realm of systems leadership and intergenerational collaboration, two powerful frameworks for addressing some of the most pressing challenges of our time. How can we help students and educators view problems through a systems lens? What role does collaboration across generations play in solving global issues like climate change or inequality? And how can schools empower learners to connect knowledge across disciplines for a more sustainable future? To help us explore these questions, I'm delighted to welcome an exceptional guest, Lee Howe, the Executive Director of the Villas Institute, a not-profit organisation at the forefront of systemic change and sustainability. Together, we'll discuss the evolution of systems leadership, its application in education, and the importance of fostering connections between generations to tackle complex issues. From strategies for curriculum integration to case studies of real-world impact, this conversation is filled with insights you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. Well, Lee, welcome to the show. It was a pleasure. I think I met you maybe a year ago and we were discussing Villas Institute and you were just so passionate about what it was doing. And it's just such a pleasure to have you on the show to be able to share with our listeners more about what this amazing institute is doing. So, Lee, I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about the Villas Institute and how it was founded to accelerate the transition to a net zero and nature-positive economy, while, of course, promoting systemic change. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about the Institute and share what inspired its creation?
Well, thank you. And let me, maybe I can sort of broaden the context of it because it stems from a journey, my own journey. I'm here in Switzerland, speaking to you from Geneva at the University of Geneva, where I'm also a professor. But I spent most of my career here at an organization called the World Economic Forum, which has it's quite well known in terms of gathering world leaders every year in a city called Davos, which is in the sort of furthest part away of Switzerland that you can imagine. Geneva, it's actually 6 hours away by train. I mentioned that because in those meetings, you often saw, it was all about having the public-private partnership sort of directed towards some major global challenge. And of course, most of these challenges are really existential environmental problems. And I came in a point in my career where I reflected on what we weren't succeeding at, but what needed to be done in some ways. And I think one area that my former organization, the World Economic Forum, I think triggered in me this thought that, hey, wait a second, in some of these issues, we really don't have an interdisciplinary approach. And so why is that? And I guess the reason is that the way the global governance systems work, so they work in silos. So, and I'll give you a really great illustration of this. We've had 4 major global meetings in the last 2 months. In October, the UN Conference on Biodiversity was held in Cali, Colombia. And only a few weeks later, there was another important conference on hopefully a treaty to end plastics pollution. Then 2 weeks after that, in November, the largest conference organized by the UN, the Conference of the Parties, the COP29 for climate, took place in Baku, Azerbaijan. And then people aren't aware of this. There was another UN conference on desertification and sort of restoration of land that took place in Riyadh earlier this month in December in Saudi Arabia. Now, most of us would think about, wow, aren't these all interconnected issues? We need nature, for example, obviously, to deal with climate change. And the biggest challenge facing nature is biodiversity loss. And that biodiversity loss is actually driven mostly by loss of habitat, right? And part of the problems of that is actually, not just extracting fossil fuels, but their derivatives, particularly plastics, and how it pollutes and such. And yet, the global governance system treats them in 4 separate tracks. And so that triggered a thought of me is we need a more interdisciplinary approach, and we need a way to bring people together. The other piece that led to the origin, again, this is a historical context of where we arrived at with the Villar Institute, was that, wait a second, okay, so let's assume we can get everybody in the room and deal with these global challenges, particularly the ones that deal with the health of the planet, as interdisciplinary problems. The timescales actually require intergenerational solutions. And this goes back to, if you take all the leaders that meet in Davos, they commit to things in 2050, often 2060, but none of them, that's beyond their political lifetimes or the tenure of any CEO. And if you reflect on it, the moment that you realize, okay, if that goal X to, reduce carbon in zero, or to reduce nature loss, or, replace plastics, where are the leaders that would be in place to really implement those things in 2050? Where are they today? And they're actually in places like the Dwight School, they're in secondary school. And so that was the idea. The notion was, okay, if you want to accelerate, back to the premise of why does the Villar Institute, was it created? The premise was, if you want to accelerate the transition to a net zero carbon emission and a nature positive economy, then first you need to actually introduce interdisciplinary collaboration. You have to couple that with intergenerational collaboration. And what's the red thread is really a systems thinking, systems leadership approach. And that formula basically led to the creation of a new institute in Villar, which happens to be itself a alpine village, even smaller than Davos, that has a rich history in education. In fact, it's home to 3 boarding schools, but it's also its proximity to Geneva in Switzerland, the French-speaking part of Switzerland, which happens to have the highest concentration of international organizations and foundations in the world. So many of the UN agencies that people might hear about in the news, the World Health Organization, or the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, or High Commissioner of Refugees, they're all headquartered in Geneva. I know New York has, of course, the UN, and of course the General Assemblies there in the fall, as we all know, and the Security Council, and I believe UNICEF. But the vast majority of the operating UN agencies are in Geneva. And on top of that, you have other organizations like the World Trade Organization, and very important foundations and organizations like the International Committee for the Red Cross. So it was a very unique opportunity to create a new institution that had at its mandate, at its core, an appreciation to engage the next generation.
That's a great background of how you got to where you are with Villar's Institute. And of course, we sent a contingent of students and teachers to the most recent Northern Hemisphere Summer Institute that you had, which was just incredible for our team. For the listeners who are really, picking up on the importance of the story of why Villar's came about, can you define systems thinking a little bit more, particularly within an educational context? And I know you're on the International Baccalaureate Governing Board too, where, again, the IB is very, very much focused on a lot of these ideas and sentiments and interdisciplinary learning that you are talking about. Can you give us a little bit more critical understanding of why and what systems thinking is, and why it's so important for the global challenges that we face?
No, thanks. That's a great question. And indeed, I'm also very privileged to be the vice chair of the Board of Governors of the International Baccalaureate, which was founded in Geneva and has its sort of administrative headquarters here with offices around the world. Let me just also preface what you asked about systems thinking, because it's also recognized increasingly as a core competency. The World Economic Forum, they have a Future of Jobs report. It was published in 2023, and they had a list of the 10 skills they think will be of rising importance in the next 5 years. And it's based on a survey of hundreds of chief human resource officers and sort of personnel managers in these big companies around the world. And interestingly, there are 2 skills that appeared on the list for the first time in the top 10 And I believe, number 7 was AI and big data. So there's no surprise. I think, well, oh yeah, of course, artificial intelligence. But number 6 was systems thinking. And so why is that? We live in a very interconnected, interdependent world. And I think the first principle is to step back and see that world as a whole, as an interconnected whole, requires systems thinking, which is at its essence is how do things connect and what's the relationship? If I said to anybody, what is systems thinking? It's sort of seeing not just the forest, and not just a tree, but more importantly, seeing the forest and its relationship to the soil and relationship to the riverbed and the fauna and birds and the whole ecosystem, and seeing the relationships, right? And there's positive feedback loops and there are negative feedback loops, and that's important. And we've done this throughout history, and part of the reason I think why systems thinking resonates today and is very interdependent, somewhat very volatile, at least geopolitically, world, is that we're looking for the means to make sense of this, make sense of the world, but also in our place in the world. We're always searching for meaning. Sometimes, ideally, it would be much more evidence-based, and that's where I think in our approach to systems thinking is really understanding the world as a complex system, and in that there's certain behaviors that are understood. We interact with complex systems every day. The weather, right? The weather is a complex system, even traffic in New York. And I think the most important thing in introducing systems thinking is that, hey, look, you're part of the system, believe it or not. Everyone influences the system in some small and sometimes big way. And that's the concept of complexity is nonlinearity, which means, some small thing can have a big effect and something big can have a very small effect. And so those are things you can introduce, most importantly, in a very early age. It's a framework for understanding the world we live in through relationships and understanding how these pieces fit together to form a whole. And we intuitively know that because some of your students get up, they leave the apartment, they might take a bus, right? And there's a transport system. But in different occasions, they might take a ride, share, a platform to get them home, or a taxi, but it's all part of the transport system, and they understand the different components. So it's not something alien. Some of these big exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, or some of these big existential environmental concerns like climate change, are all systems change, systemic. And if you're not fluent and not really sort of understand just how systems and how these different components form, I think you're in a bad spot. I can appreciate the fact that you might think of a system and you don't know how to sort of see it and appreciate it, that you might be filled with anxiety. And we talk about anxiety. That's something very real. It could also lead to anger because you see that system as exogenous or outside of your control or influence. Like it's unfair, and why is it set up this way? Or the worst, it's apathy. And it's like, this is what we'd saw sort of an exogenous or something that is just outside, your influence. So why, sweat it and, move on. Those are all not, I don't think they're healthy. I think rather what we want through systems thinking is at least apply it so that you have a sense of agency. So you say, wait a second. Oh, I see where I fit in the system. I see, for example, I make a choice every day about, let's say, what I eat. And that choice could be very good for me, my health. Probably eat more like myself. Probably need to eat more green vegetables, maybe more seasonal things, but it could be good for the planet. Because the wrong choice could actually lead to more carbon emissions, or could be a kind of a crop or a food source that is problematic because it drives, biodiversity loss. Our mobility choice, it's probably healthier to walk across town and good for your health, and probably good for the planet if you're avoiding, internal combustion engine driven vehicle, right? And with that system thinking, if you couple that with a sense of purpose and ambition, you get to a place of leadership, systems leadership, which is a different approach to it because you have so many different stakeholders that you have to engage. But I think that's the journey we want to begin with, particularly teachers and young people and learners of all ages and educators, is that systems thinking is something that is actually right now fit for purpose with the world we live in. If you think about how we, in our understanding of the world today, geopolitically, economically, culturally, digitally, environmentally, it is a system. It's a complex system. And the sooner we can get people comfortable with systems thinking, I think we'll be in a better place.
That's a great segue. I mean, we really don't want people to be apathetic complacent, as you said. We want them to be able to understand the systems that they are working within and how they can influence those systems. But then, as you said, that moves into this strategy of systems leadership, and also what you were talking about before about how do we also create leaders now who are ready to meet the missions and goals that current leaders are making on behalf of us. And again, this element of complacency. So can you describe a little bit more about what Villas is doing and what we should be doing and what educators should be thinking about creating systems leadership, amongst our faculty and staff, amongst our students, to be more active in the systems that they indeed live within?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I guess we're trying to go from an idea to some sort of practice, right, or habit, ideally. And I suppose let me just frame what systems leadership and why it differs from, I guess, our more common, perceptions about leadership, right? I mean, first, we're used to leadership where you have actual authority. You're the police chief and you're the police sergeant, and that's a rank thing, and you have the authority to tell your subordinates what to do, and they have to act on it, and very hierarchical. I'm sure your students have studied Nelson Mandela and Gandhi and others. They were not, they didn't have actually that authority. It wasn't given to them, but they're more authority. They had this apparent authority because people believed in them, and they had that that charisma, that sense of purpose, the authenticity, all those elements. And it didn't come from the fact that they were a CEO, a general, or a elected, minister, right? They were leaders that were able to mobilize society around, things that mattered to that community, but without actually having the actual authority. So it's important to understand that when you get to a system, you're in the system, but often it's also very difficult to figure out who actually runs the entire system or bits of parts of it. And certainly you don't feel like you have that actual authority. So I think it starts with this notion of, well, okay, I'm part of the system. Who else is part of the system? And what's the relationship? And if I know that relationship, the second question is, do I have a relationship with that person, right? These are different stakeholders. What will help me develop that relationship? Certainly, I think it's the best relationships are ones built on trust, right? And I think that's a very important lesson for us in education, and also sort of committed to, I think of Dwight School as it's a private school with a very public purpose. You want to develop, graduates and help them really give back to society. And I think one of the things we forget is that ideas are very powerful. They lead to innovation, but ultimately you have to convince individuals within institutions to embrace those ideas. And that is complex in itself, but it's also a matter of less IQ, in some ways EQ, right? Really understanding people, empathy, justice. Because if I were simply said, okay, there's a systemic problem, we've identified one of the nodes, one of the key kind of drivers, this area is X in a big nexus issue, we should address it, and not factor in that there are other stakeholders, there are probably other people closer to the problem who probably are closer to the solution as well, because it is, you have to deal with the fact that no one has that full and sort of actual authority over all the entire system. Secondly, it is a coordination issue. And so every organization has a few people who are mandated to work together to sort of look after the goal, pursue the goals of the organization. So the United States government has a cabinet, right? There's a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of this, and there's a National Security Council. And these are all coordinating bodies that work together. And that's because it's very hard to do big things if you have to spend time coordinating with everybody and negotiating transactions with them. The main point is that you have to, in this sort of space, recognize that you're not A, going to be doing it alone, B, that if you want to coordinate and get things done really well, you have to build trust. And I give you a sports example. Well, the Knicks are doing pretty well these days, I believe, in New York. But if you watch very good, basketball is a good sport. Like you sometimes are amazed at how they're able to throw a pass without looking, and yet all of a sudden the person is there because they have a high degree of trust. They know that that person will be there because they've really understood each other. And in a way, it's like, there's in music's too. It's amazing when you listen to jazz, how people just sort of pick up. But that orchestration is really built on a lot of, it's fundamental about trust, right? I'm about to do something and I trust that you'll be there and sort of help me get, to achieve what with our common goal. And so to build trust is something that we don't spend enough time practicing. And also then, by extension, showing that with that trust, you can actually mobilize different stakeholders. And that's a bit about community organization. With community, there's probably a common interest in something. And then we need to go from that common interest, which is ideally it's a problem that needs addressing or an unmet need of the community. And in that community, we go from that interest to, I would hope, some sort of action. And once we work on that action, the third part of it is that we start to share practice. And that's why in a lot of literature, people talk about communities of interest, community of action, or community purpose. I skipped a main point. That interest has to translate to some common purpose, right? And then you get to an action, and then there's a practice. But those are kind of the elements of systems leadership. And that's why, what you want to do is have your students or your teachers identify a problem, figure out who else has a stake in it, try to build interest around it. In that stakeholder group, what's the common purpose? And then from there, maybe find a shared sort of, at least part of the community can take some action and then reflect on that.
It's a really good point about talking about inspiring kids to be able to make these systemic changes, and the leadership's going to help do that. Can you give an example of perhaps a Villas Institute project of how we've really engaged youth to make that change and involve generations in this systems thinking? Because I think our listeners would be very interested about whether, they may not be able to get their children to a Villas Institute, but can you give them an idea of a project and how that was how students move through that?
I'll kind of go with two extremes. One is just recently and we're in Geneva, so we had an opportunity to be part of something called Building Bridges. In those of you, maybe listeners who are in London, there's a London Climate Week, and in New York, there's always the UN General Assembly, which has its own sort of climate week of activities where different organizations come together. And there was a particular challenge around how do you actually restore nature at scale? Because at the end of the day, people are talking about the role of nature to deal with climate, nature-based solutions and such, but there's an underlying issue around nature, which is the loss of biodiversity, principally. And then also, how do we mobilize funding for it? There's a scientific consensus around the importance of preserving nature and biodiversity. There is not yet kind of a social science or economic consensus about what's actually the value. How do you truly make nature an asset, or biodiversity an asset on balance sheet, right? So, and in that, we invited our fellows to be part of that conversation because I'm close to 60 now that I'm to 50, but I would say I'm doing this for my kids or my grandkids, and that's why I'm working on this. But do I ever ask them, how interested are you, or how much confidence do you have in my approach? Am I looking at the right problem? Am I not? And so what we did, first, we have a survey. So we have a global, I think it's the only youth survey of VLAR fellows, 300 of these young people around the world. And we asked them, really, when it comes to nature, let's say, for example, this concept of nature positive to sort of reduce nature loss by biodiversity loss 30% in the next 30 years, how much of an impact will it have on your career in the next 5 years, in your education goals, or in your lifestyle? And we asked that. And then because it turned out that in some areas, youth are very aware of the energy transition, but less aware of nature. And we took that actually to the principal people who were working on this and said, here's what the data says. So before you talk about doing something that's going to be, a multi-generational solution, you should sort of understand how the youth are thinking about it. And we were able to present that and have fellows there asking questions to many of the financiers and others and bankers who are working in finance. So that's one area. Another area that's more around the school, let's say, is we focus quite a bit on our mission of dealing with the net zero emission and a nature positive economy. There's one sector that is sort of the biggest, both the problem and the solution to this, and it is the agri-food sector. So food production is about a quarter of the emissions that we have to deal with. It is the agri-food forestry is the biggest user and polluter of fresh water. And it is also the biggest driver of 50% of most of biodiversity loss because of land use. Okay. So, the food system that we needs to be sustainable for the planet, but we have another problem, which is, as you know, unfortunately, particularly in North America, of overnutrition. Now, there's undernutrition in other parts of the world, and we see that, and we're very concerned, of course, with the incidence of non-communicable disease like type 2 diabetes, right? The prevalence of that. So ideally, we would have a food system that's sustainable, that is also healthy. And there's been a lot of scientific work in this. And I'm part of the foundation, another foundation called the EAT Foundation that studies this. And there is a recommendation of the types of food that are sustainable, that sort of work within what are known the 9 planetary boundaries that scientists have identified as really important to sort of sustain the health of the planet, but also the types of food. I say all that as context because fundamentally it gets down to, can our schools think about creating, food choices that actually support both, actually advance both goals, which is much healthier young people, or and lives, and also a sustainable planet. And there exists something called the planetary health diet. And that was picked up by some of our students in some of our partner schools, and it started the conversation, and it led to conversations at 2 points. One, very practical. It's something called the Eat Lancet Commission. The Lancet is the British medical journal. It's like the New England Journal of Medicine. They're the 2 best medical journals. When they did this study, they said, look, here are the foods, and it's common sense, right? We should probably eat much less red meat because of the impact on emissions, methane and such, but more vegetables and such. But protein is very important, and it's also contextual. Where you are in the world, you're going to source it. So what the students did, they said, look, one, where are we, what's the framework for our cafeteria? Like, what's the principle? What's the guiding thing? What's the parameters? Are we eating things that are sustainable or local or whatever? But by the way, here's some science that says actually these are the better foods for nutritional outcomes, but also planetary health outcomes. And then secondly, what that led to in some schools is, oh, well, wait a second, that's a new idea, planetary boundaries. What is that? And it led to, a discussion about, is that the right rubric to sort of introduce, to talk about? Because there are 9 planetary boundaries identified by scientists that clearly say these are systems that we've measured, where human impact and activity has brought us to what they've identified as these tipping points, that if actually we continue to do what we do in terms of how we consume and move and produce things, we're going to kind of overshoot these boundaries and get into very, sort of bad spaces. These are complex systems. So there's a study around fresh water. There's a piece around soil. It's a wonderful thing. The point here was that the students were able to actually help the teachers sort of rethink this, because, for example, if all of the curriculum and environment is tied around a number, let's say 1.5 degrees Celsius, sadly, unfortunately, we're going to probably overshoot that in this decade. But does that mean we've sort of given up on the curriculum around that? No. So I think, we could think about another framework, or or something like the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, lots of indicators. Not likely to reach all of them by 2030, but does that mean we stop learning about these elements? And I think the planetary boundaries is one thing we've put forward as maybe a new way of framework. These are 9 clear boundaries that you can look at Earth systems. And again, it sort of reinforces this interdisciplinary approach. But I use that example because the young people came to the symposium, heard from the scientists themselves about this planetary boundary concept. They learned from another expert about planetary health diet as a framework. They were then, asked to go back and really reflect on it. And it was so meaningful to them that the first thing, and I remember this because there's 4 different schools from 4 different countries, they all said, well, gosh, our cafeteria, I'm not getting these choices, and they're separate. Like, we'll have an issue about zero waste and recycling, but there's nothing on the nutrition side. Or maybe they have a really great program on the nutrition, but they don't talk about the sustainability. And they said, well, we should be doing both. And here's a framework. And they were able to go back. And that framework, although it started in the cafeteria, led to the classroom, because it said, well, what about the science behind this? Because we spoke to the scientists. And so why, can we get the latest science and translate that into, of course, our focus when it comes to the next gen is between the ages of 13 and 19, more or less. And we think and it's and it's that period of adolescence, right? I mean, we know the social science, we even know the science, the biological science about adolescence. It's a very important period of development of young people, and they are very much concerned about the state of the world. They're starting to get that awareness. There's a variety of different frameworks, but one of the frameworks is really to understand the world as a system, and in that system that they have agency, and in that system there's points, there's areas that you can intervene. It could be in food, it could be others, but there, you can influence and shape that system. I think that's really important to understand, particularly introduced during your adolescence, because we know so much more now, and maybe a little more concerned because of the influence of social media and such in that development period. And we're also post-COVID, let's not forget, understanding the wellness and the mental health dimensions of this. So I think in all of this, I get concerned when we talk about climate anxiety, all these anxieties, and not doing more to at least nurture the ambition and create and also help them develop a sense of agency in all this. I'm not discounting that these are not genuine anxieties in their different forms, but we also need to show that they are the system. They can shape that system, right? And that's really important.
I certainly know from being an IB educator, when we do a lot of that interdisciplinary work, we see the light bulb moments go off for students, and we want to capture that. Can you talk a little bit more about why these cross-disciplinary skills are so vital for their journey beyond school, right? Going off to university, the workplace, and how systems thinking can prepare students for those future roles where that motivation, that incentive can still be very vital for them as they go on to next steps in their life.
So I'll give you a concrete example. We have been approached by one of the large, what they call the big four accounting firms, consulting firms, to introduce leadership systems thinking to their consultants. And so begs the question, why, right? And because they're very good consultants, but they focus quite a bit on design thinking. They're very much around solving a problem. And often what we now appreciate is that, generally speaking, there are unintended consequences of many of these solutions, actually, right? And there's, like, you can, for example, and I'll give you one that maybe listeners, this has nothing to consult, but I'll just give you concrete. So we could say, okay, trees are good for the planet. They're a good carbon sink. They absorb the carbon dioxide. But imagine, and this is what happens, and you could say the trillion trees would be good, but what if they're all pine trees? That would be devastating for biodiversity, and it would also be devastating in many other ways. It would create probably a lot more forest fires, actually landslides, because you need that biodiversity, right, in the system. It makes it much more resilient. And then, in fact, over time, is a greater carbon sink. So, and I use that example because we sort of think of, there's something social science called the single action bias. The fact that I recycle everything makes me, very environmentally conscious. But it's not like that. It takes more than one step. It might even be you should maybe start fundamentally with your reuse of the materials. Maybe you shouldn't be using any of the materials that you recycle, right? And so you have to think through the system. And the classic example, which I teach, is, of course, electric vehicles. And why these consultants need to know this is that, okay, you could be a proponent of electric vehicles, but then, look at New York City. How would people charge if most people need to park on the street? Or how would you? Secondly, what if the source of electricity is, it's got to come from, ideally, right? Ideally, it would be from a renewable source and not from a fossil fuel. If it's a coal burning electric plant that's charging your battery for your electric vehicle, that's not getting us to net zero. So that's why it's about increasingly connecting the dots, because we live in a world with so many unintended consequences, and we have more fundamentally a problem with externalities, which economists go, these are things, harms that we don't price into the products and services that we deliver. And businesses and general governments and all sectors of society are much more aware of that. So, and in other areas, our own personal health, we start to recognize that certain behaviors and such have maybe not in the short term, but a long-term consequence. And that's a bit of a systems thinking, kind of connecting some dots down the road. That's more of a temporal exercise, but still it's important to say, okay, there's things I do today that may seem great, but they may be harmful later. So I need to rethink that. And there's plenty of examples, particularly in technology and innovation where we were really embraced. One generation thought this is an amazing development. And like, let's say commercial aviation, you could even take plastics. And then down 2-3 generations later, we didn't really recognize that it's actually part of the problem. And it's a hard one, right? I mean, one of the hardest to abate industries in terms of reducing carbon emissions is aviation. So, it's very hard to find instances where something that's amazing didn't have some sort of downstream effect into that turned out to be not so good. And that's why we need to be system seekers. And we see it today in social media, in digital use. There's a narrative that said this is about access to X and Y and freedom to get information. But then we didn't think through that actually there might be other outcomes. And that systems thinking requires that reflection. And we are now facing it, as you know, with general artificial intelligence in terms of, in learning and education relationship with these large language models. And really, what does that mean, the near and the longer term? And that's connecting the dots, right? And that's why I think systems thinking is very important.
Do you see any emerging trends in education about systems thinking and leadership? Is it from an AI perspective? Is it focusing on one particular area? What do you see educators actually picking up and focusing on?
I'll give you an example. I think we are seeing educators, at least in their own way, realizing that it's really important to be able to help the students make these connections and not necessarily label it systems thinking, right? For example, you have a conflict, and I'll take one I even teach in the university. So, 2 years ago, we saw what happened in Russia and Ukraine. What people didn't realize that why did that lead to massive inflation prices of wheat in Lebanon or cooking oil in India, right? Well, because our students start to understand that, hey, we did know that Ukraine was, a very, very important a source of food grains, but also of cooking oils, right? And that these other countries, they don't actually produce that domestically. And so we are in this very interdependent, interconnected world. And I think today with technology and with some of the discussions, I think in the North America context about tariffs between Canada and US or Mexico, we don't know the knock-on effects, right? You have to think through these things. You have to say, okay, if you triple the price of X or don't have access to Y technology, what's that going to do downstream? And that's why businesses are recognized as a very important skill, because it's anticipatory. At least it doesn't predict the future, but it makes you more anticipatory and say, okay, if we, stop selling this kind of chip to that part of the world, what's that going to mean in terms of development of that technology? Now, back to AI, I think, the reality is fundamentally it can be a very good tool and agent, provided we address its governance problems. There are some governance problems. I think paradoxically, in my experience, AI works if you actually have a lot of domain knowledge about what you're about to use AI. If you have very little domain knowledge and you ask AI anything, and you won't know if it's hallucinating or telling something wrong or not and such. So it sort of favors right now, if you're a very knowledgeable person but really don't have time to summarize or do something, it can be quite useful. But if you're in a place where you need to learn something, it's not going to help you there, because you can't trust it, right? It's just essentially it goes out and crawls across what's publicly available and essentially predicts what the right answer is. In fact, it is the great demonstration of passing the Turing test, right? You just don't know you're talking to a computer. It just chats and says things, but it could be saying nonsense, right? But it's out of the bat. I mean, I don't think you're going to put the genie back in the bottle, as they say. I think agents will be I think it could become very good tutors. I'll give you an example of a project we're doing. I mentioned to you these 9 planetary boundaries that the scientists have established, and there's a lot of scientific literature around it. We have a postdoctoral grant. We have a grant to support postdoctoral students, and we're working with some in MIT to create a generative AI-based sort of tutoring agent that can would just only look at the data, the scientific papers around these 9 boundaries, and could help, a young person kind of tutor them on this, right? So, you would be able to ask this AI agent, like, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about what's happened with the ozone layer, right? Or in terms of the boundary and where we are today. And it would only sort of synthesize, summarize, and express what's in that, peer-reviewed scientific database. And that's the big area I think we challenge in education is, could there be a one sort of Google-like search, AI that would answer all questions? And I think not, because the energy it takes to be able to ask a question about a cat, and it's going to have to go through cat pictures and videos and all sorts of unstructured data, the energy consumption and the cost of this is so high. What I think will happen is that in certain domains in education, we'll have much more discrete AI platforms where we know it's sitting on top of very evidence-based or peer-reviewed sort of source of information, and it could help us as teachers in many ways, because that's just information. That's not knowledge or insight. That's the job of us as educators, right? We're the curators and the communicators, and we also understand each student and what their needs are to sort of really, again, getting back to the core principle of getting them curious and somehow instilling a sense of ambition. That is not AI. That isn't the analog. That isn't the real world, right? Although people can say that, they could deal with maybe loneliness and other things. There's a lot of interesting companies kind of playing with this stuff, but I think it's in the classroom, it can be quite helpful if it's the right kind of AI platform, and we have a teacher who really understands the content, that domain knowledge, and can trust it to help save his or her time. But the real art of this is translation. It's like, how do we make this meaningful for the student, right? How do we make it matter to the learner? A young person today has more information available to her than any other civilization on the planet. Just imagine the fact that the biggest teaching platform theoretically is YouTube. You just say, how do I peel a banana? And there you go. How do I, anything, query. And amazingly, someone has done a video about it, right? But is that real? Is that what, that's something that is, I think, very different from, I think, what parents and ourselves, what we all aspire to do as educators and being a learning community, right? There's something more than that, but it does help save time, and you can in trusted sources, but that's still not making the difference, I don't think. And so, that's kind of my take on it. That's and it's yet to be seen. We'll see, right? We're in the middle of these early transition.
Very true. And maybe this is my final question, and just as we sum up here, but you're talking about the future, and we're not quite sure. We don't have a crystal ball, but what is your future for systems leadership as we continue to work with students and hoping to help them with these global challenges? Do you have a particular final statement or vision of what we hope it might be moving towards?
Well, I have a particular bias, I may say, and you'll be surprised. So think about the energy transition, right? It's a big systemic change. We have to reduce all our emissions to zero. It's not just me and Geneva and you in New York, it's everyone. In that is an amazing embedded opportunity, but, and it's the but, there are things that maybe, we're not giving enough thought about, which is really trades and skills and vocational. So I'll give you a concrete example. In Europe, we need to have heat pumps. We need several million of them. Obviously, it's like taking all the carbon, emissions from all the cars in Europe, and it would lead to 750, by estimates, probably 800,000 new jobs on top of that, really skilled jobs. And the problem is that, are we set up from a labor market point of view? It's not just an allocation of capital, it's an allocation of talent. Or I'll use another example. The vice chairman of our board of foundation was in charge of the British nuclear energy program, and is now focused on commercializing fusion. But do you know, to build these, if you were able to create these reactors, you would need a lot of pipe fitters and welders and lots of skills and trades that our education system today is not training, because essentially most of our goals, we're very path dependent. We're trying to get a person to the next stage of their educational journey. Yet, are we really helping them? AI will not be able to weld this joint that you're going to need, right? So I think there's something to be said about going back to things that we do and learning manual and skills in hands. And this is my key point, because in Switzerland, it's not either or. You can do it together. In Switzerland, we can track people very early as having maybe an academic bent career, but if they don't, they can go and learn a trade. But if they learn it well, they also can come back to it. It's not a tracking system like in other parts of Europe, where you're at 14, you're going to be a tradesperson, and 16, you're going to, you're tracked as a university. And I think that is going to be key, because the transition will create different opportunities with different skill sets. Sometimes it'll be more about the mind, maybe it's more about the hands, maybe it's both. Maybe it'll be more entrepreneurial, or maybe you'll have to be working in a larger work environment. We have to be able to prepare young people for all of those possibilities, because what you want is to be able for our learners to have options, because with options come choices, right? You can make. And so that's what we have to do. And I think there is to be something said, and that's where I don't call it systems thinking, but if we start to think about what we need to connect, you'll arrive, some of the points I made, I think will resonate, because that's what it's going to require. And the tension, one of the things we're working at the VLR Institute concretely is we want to get, particularly in primary and tertiary and secondary education, to think about the future of learning. So we have a global learning council. Let's just step away. Let's take away our what part of education are we at? Because that's sort of certified, formalized, but we're learning all the time. What do we need to learn? How can we align ourselves? Because some of the tensions, I hear all the time, a university president will say, well, we need these sorts of young people in the next class. And then the high school, secondary school leaders will say, well, Lee, that's what we want to do, but that doesn't show up in their admissions criteria. And so we're trying to create a space with what we call the Global Learning Council, but we have a conference on this that says, okay, let's rethink this. What's the future of learning? What are the citizens that we need to help develop good citizens, globally minded, very environmentally conscious, just good people? What do they need to learn? And then how can we make sure that we are not at odds with each other, those of us who are in the different segments of education, primary, secondary, tertiary, but also vocational education? How can we help each other out? And that's a bit of systems thinking, right? And systems leadership.
Well, look, Lee, we're incredibly grateful for you giving us, more of an insight into systems thinking, into intergenerational sort of disciplinary work that is so needed, and leadership. And I know our listeners will have learned a lot more about systems thinking from hearing from you today. And of course, thank you for all the work that you're doing with Villas Institute. I only wish many, many students could have the experience of going there and working through the program that you have there. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. You're great students. And that's what we're working on, is how can we actually reach out to many more students? And you have wonderful students at the Dwight Schools, and you have them around the world. So it's great to be partnering with you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your listeners today.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Sparking Genius. Again, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our remarkable guest, Lee Howell, Executive Director of the Villas Institute. Your insights into system thinking and intergenerational collaboration have been both enlightening and deeply motivating. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope today's conversation has ignited new ideas and provided valuable takeaways for integrating systems leadership and collaborative approaches into your schools and communities. In an ever-changing world, these innovative frameworks are essential for empowering the next generation to tackle complex challenges with confidence and creativity. If you found this episode meaningful, we'd love for you to subscribe to Sparking Genius and to share it with fellow educators and innovators. Together, we can continue to explore the ideas that are transforming the world of education. I'm Dianne Drew, and I look forward to sparking more genius with you in the next episode. Until then, stay curious and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in education.